It was a chilly evening in New York City, and the streets were alive with the usual chaos of honking cars, flashing billboards, and hurried pedestrians. Inside a luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, James Crawford sat in his leather armchair, swirling a glass of aged whiskey. He was a man who had everything: money, power, and influence. But despite all his success, his heart was filled with arrogance, and his mind was poisoned by the belief that love was secondary to wealth. But despite all his success, his heart had grown cold over the years, hardened by ambition and poisoned by the belief that love was secondary to wealth. The warmth that had once drawn Emily to him had gradually disappeared, replaced by a calculating coldness that measured everything, even relationships, in terms of profit and loss. Emily stood by the fireplace, nervously twisting the hem of her dress between her fingers. 3 years ago, she had walked down the aisle with stars in her eyes, believing she had found her forever in James. She remembered how he had once looked at her like she was his entire world, how they had danced under the moonlight on their honeymoon in Paris, how he had whispered promises of a beautiful future together. Those memories now seemed like scenes from someone else's life. She had been trying to gather the courage to tell him the news for days, but every time she looked into his cold, calculating eyes, she hesitated. Tonight, however, she could wait no longer. The tiny life growing inside her deserved a chance, deserved to be acknowledged by its father. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her heart pounding against her ribs. "James, I have something to tell you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. James barely acknowledged her, continuing to swirl the whiskey in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "Go ahead," he said, his tone indifferent, as if she were a business associate presenting an uninteresting proposal. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. For a moment, there was silence. James placed his glass on the table and turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. Emily felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this news would soften him. Perhaps it would bring back the man she had fallen in love with. Then, instead of joy or excitement, a smirk spread across his face. "Pregnant," he repeated, almost mockingly. "And I suppose you expect me to believe this child is mine?" Emily's heart sank, the hope in her chest instantly replaced by a cold, sickening dread. She instinctively placed a protective hand over her stomach. "James, what are you saying? Of course it's yours. We've been married for 3 years. Why would I lie about this?" James stood up abruptly, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. The firelight caught the hard lines of his face, making him look almost demonic. "Don't play innocent, Emily. My mother warned me about you from the start. She said you were just after my money, and now you're proving her right." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. This wasn't the reaction she had rehearsed in her mind. In her dreams, he had taken her in his arms, kissed her forehead, and thanked her for this precious gift. "Your mother?" "James, your mother has never liked me. She always wanted you to marry someone from your own social circle. But I loved you for who you were, not for your money." The memory of their early days flashed through her mind, how they had met at a charity event, how he had pursued her despite his mother's disapproval, how they had spent long nights talking about their dreams and hopes. Where had that James gone? James let out a bitter laugh. "Love? Don't make me laugh. I see it now. You think this baby will secure your place in my life, that you'll have a permanent claim to my wealth." Emily shook her head in disbelief, tears now streaming down her face. "I don't want your money, James. I just wanted to share this joy with you. I thought you would be happy. I thought we would build a family together, like we always talked about." James took a step closer, his face inches from hers, his breath hot against her skin. "I don't trust you, Emily, and I won't let you trap me with a child." Her hands instinctively went to her stomach, as if protecting the life growing inside her from his cruel words. "James, please don't do this," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "This is our child, our baby." But James had made up his mind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. "Here," he said, scribbling a number with cold precision. "Take this and leave." You'll never have to worry about money again." Emily stared at the check, horrified. The sum was obscene, enough to live comfortably for years. But all she could see was the price tag he was putting on their marriage, on their unborn child, on what she had thought was love. "You think I can be bought?" she said, her voice breaking with the weight of realization. "You think I would trade my child for a piece of paper?" James's face hardened, the last trace of humanity disappearing from his eyes. "If you don't want the money, then leave with nothing. But you're not staying here. Pack your things and get out." The finality in his voice sent a chill down Emily's spine. She realized then that the man she had married no longer existed, if he ever had. The James she had fallen in love with had been an illusion, a mask worn by a man incapable of true love. Without another word, she turned and walked to the bedroom, tears streaming down her face. She packed a small bag, her hands trembling as she folded a few clothes, took her personal items. This was her home, the place where she had built dreams with him, and now she was being thrown out like a stranger. When she stepped out of the room, James was standing by the door, his arms crossed, watching her with cold detachment. "Don't ever come back," he said coldly. Emily looked at him one last time, searching his face for even a flicker of regret, a hint of the man she had once loved. But there was none. His eyes were as empty as the promises he had made. With a heavy heart, she turned and walked out into the freezing night, the door closing firmly behind her. The sound echoed in her ears like a death knell for all her dreams. She had nowhere to go. Her family was in Chicago, miles away, and she had few friends in the city. James had always preferred they socialize with his business associates rather than form meaningful connections. She wandered the streets of Manhattan, the neon lights and bustling crowds a cruel contrast to the emptiness she felt inside. The snowflakes melted against her warm tears as she clutched her stomach, whispering, "I'll take care of you, my baby. No matter what happens, I won't let you suffer." As the hours passed and the temperature dropped, the reality of her situation sank in. She had no home, no money, and no one to turn to. But as she looked down at her still flat stomach, she felt something stir within her. Not just the tiny life she carried, but a fierce determination she didn't know she possessed. She refused to let James's cruelty break her. She would survive. She would raise her child with love, even if she had to do it alone. Little did she know that 20 years later, fate would bring her back to the man who had abandoned her. But this time, the tables would be turned. Emily shivered as she walked through the streets of New York City, the biting wind cutting through her thin coat like knives. The towering skyscrapers, once symbols of excitement and dreams when she'd first arrived with James, now felt suffocating. Cold monoliths indifferent to her suffering. Her whole life had collapsed in a matter of hours. The man she had loved, the one she had trusted with her heart, had thrown her out without hesitation, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenient business liability. She wrapped her arms around her stomach protectively, feeling the slight swell of her pregnancy. There was no visible bump yet, but knowing this life depended entirely on her filled Emily with both terror and resolve. She had no home, no money, and nowhere to go. The realization was overwhelming, but she refused to break down in the middle of the street. She had to think. She had to survive, not just for herself anymore. "We'll be okay," she whispered to her unborn child, her breath visible in the cold air. "I don't know how yet, but we will." As the night deepened, Emily wandered aimlessly through the streets, looking for a place to rest. The temperature continued to drop, and her fingers had grown numb. She considered finding a shelter, but the stories she'd heard about the conditions in such places made her hesitant. Eventually, she wandered into Grand Central Terminal, drawn by its warmth and the anonymity of crowds. Finding a bench in a quieter corner, she sat down, exhaustion washing over her like a wave. Her body ached from hours of walking, and hunger gnawed at her stomach, reminding her she hadn't eaten since morning. Around her, travelers rushed to catch their trains, their lives moving forward while hers had come to a screeching halt. Businessmen in expensive suits hurried past, reminding her painfully of James. Families embraced in tearful reunions, making her loneliness feel even more acute. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise and gather her thoughts. Sleep wouldn't come, though her body craved it. She needed a plan. She couldn't stay in New York. The city was too expensive, and every street held memories of the life she had lost. She needed a fresh start, somewhere far from James's influence. Emily thought of her old college friend Rachel, who lived in Chicago. They had been roommates for 4 years, sharing late-night study sessions and dreams of the future. They had lost touch over the years, especially after Emily had married James, who had subtly discouraged her from maintaining old friendships. Rachel had always been kind-hearted, though, the type of person who would give you her last dollar if you needed it. It was a long shot, but Emily had no other options. With renewed purpose, she made her way to Port Authority bus terminal, her hands trembling from both cold and anxiety as she approached the ticket counter. The terminal was harsh under fluorescent lights, filled with weary travelers and the smell of fast food that made her empty stomach clench. The clerk barely looked up from his computer. "Next," he called, boredom evident in his voice. I need a bus ticket to Chicago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, feeling smaller than she ever had before. "One way or round trip?" he asked mechanically. Emily hesitated. A round trip would mean she had a place to return to, that this was just a temporary setback. But there was nothing left for her in New York except painful memories and a man who had discarded her like yesterday's newspaper. "One way," she murmured, the words feeling like a final surrender. "That'll be $120, the clerk said, tapping at his screen. Emily's stomach dropped. She reached into her purse, though she already knew what she would find. She had left in such a hurry that she'd taken only her wallet, which contained her ID, a credit card James would surely cancel by morning, and less than $40 in cash. She had nothing, absolutely nothing. She stepped aside, her mind racing. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She had never begged in her life, had always prided herself on her independence. But what choice did she have now? Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she approached a middle-aged woman who looked kind, someone who might understand another woman's plight. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, hating how her voice trembled. "I'm in a really bad situation. I need to get to Chicago, and I don't have enough money for a bus ticket. If you could spare anything, I promise I'll find a way to pay you back." The woman's eyes darted away, uncomfortable with the directness of the request. "I'm sorry, I can't help," she muttered, walking away quickly. Emily swallowed hard, humiliation burning her cheeks. She tried again, approaching an elderly man with gentle eyes, then a businessman in a sharp suit who reminded her painfully of James, then a young couple holding hands. The responses were the same: pity, avoidance, rejection. Some looked at her with suspicion, others with discomfort, but none were willing to help. After an hour of this, Emily sat on a bench, tears threatening to spill over. She had never felt so alone, so utterly helpless. The weight of her situation, pregnant, homeless, abandoned, pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. "Hey, you okay?" a voice asked. She looked up to see a tall, lanky man with kind eyes and weathered skin. His clothes were worn but clean, and there was something in his expression that spoke of hardship overcome. "I'm fine," she said automatically, wiping at her eyes. He sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "No offense, but you don't look fine, and I've been watching you ask folks for help. Chicago, huh?" Emily nodded, too exhausted to be wary. "I grew up there," he said with a small smile. "South Side. Tough, but good people. How much do you need?" $120, she said, embarrassment coloring her voice. "But I can't." The man nodded and pulled out his wallet without hesitation. It was worn leather, cracked with age. He counted out bills, mostly 20s and 10s, until he had the exact amount. He handed it to her without fanfare. "I can't take this," Emily protested, though her fingers itched to accept the lifeline. "I've been where you are," he said simply. "Maybe not exactly the same situation, but I know what it's like when the world turns its back on you." He pressed the money into her hand. "Just promise me you'll pay it forward when you can." That's how we survive in this world, by helping each other through the dark times. Tears filled Emily's eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd been fighting all day. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of the realization that kindness still existed in a world that had been so cruel to her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You have no idea what this means to me." "I think I do," he said with a gentle smile. "Now go get your ticket before they sell out." An hour later, she was on the bus, watching the city lights disappear behind her as they crossed the George Washington Bridge. New York had been her home for 3 years, the place where she had believed her dreams would come true. Now she was leaving with nothing but a small bag of belongings and an unborn child. As the miles stretched on and the bus hummed beneath her, Emily thought about what lay ahead. She didn't know if Rachel would take her in. She didn't know how she would support herself and a baby. She didn't know if she would ever recover from James's betrayal. But for the first time since he had thrown her out, she felt a glimmer of hope, a tiny flame that refused to be extinguished by fear or uncertainty. When the bus pulled into Chicago the next morning, Emily felt a wave of nervousness mixed with determination. The city sprawled before her, vast and unfamiliar, yet somehow less intimidating than New York had become. She had memorized Rachel's last known address from an old Christmas card, but had no phone to call ahead. What if Rachel had moved? What if she didn't remember her? What if she turned her away? She stepped off the bus, taking a deep breath of the crisp Chicago air. It was different from New York, less polished, but somehow warmer, more honest. With the last of her money, she hailed a cab and gave Rachel's address in Lincoln Park, a modest neighborhood that felt worlds away from the luxury she had left behind. As the cab wove through the city streets, Emily tried to calm her nerves by focusing on the scenery, the distinctive architecture, the glimpses of Lake Michigan between buildings, the people going about their daily lives. When they reached a modest apartment building with brick facade and window boxes, Emily hesitated, doubt creeping in once more. "This is it, lady," the cab driver said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Emily paid him with the last of her cash and stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the building. Summoning her courage, she walked to the entrance, found Rachel's name on the directory, and pressed the buzzer before she could lose her nerve. Seconds felt like hours before a crackly voice came through the intercom. "Hello, Rachel? It's Emily. Emily Carter." She paused, then added, "From college." There was a moment of silence, then the buzz of the door unlocking. Emily made her way up to the 3rd floor, her heart pounding with each step. When she reached apartment 3C, the door opened before she could knock. Rachel stood there, her curly hair shorter than Emily remembered, her eyes widening in shock as she took in the sight of her old friend. "Emily," she gasped, recognition and concern washing over her face. The composure Emily had maintained throughout her journey suddenly crumbled. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she stood there, clutching her small bag, the weight of the past 24 hours crashing down on her. I didn't know where else to go," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Rachel took one look at her, her worn-out clothes, her tired eyes, the way she protectively placed a hand over her stomach, and without hesitation pulled her into a hug. "Come inside," she said firmly, her voice warm with the friendship that had once sustained them through late-night study sessions and broken hearts. The warmth of the apartment enveloped Emily as she stepped in. It was small but cozy, filled with books and framed pictures, colorful throw pillows, and the scent of fresh coffee. It wasn't grand like the penthouse she had shared with James, but felt more like a home than that place ever had. Rachel led her to the couch and handed her a blanket, then disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a steaming mug of tea. She sat beside Emily, concern etched on her face. "Tell me everything," she said simply, reaching out to squeeze Emily's cold hand. Emily took a shaky breath and began to speak. The words poured out of her. How she had met James at a charity event, their whirlwind romance, the gradual change in him after marriage, his mother's constant disapproval, the pregnancy, and finally, the cruel way he had thrown her out without a second thought. Rachel listened in silence, her expression shifting from concern to outrage as the story unfolded. When Emily finished, Rachel's eyes had darkened with anger. "That bastard," she muttered, shaking her head. "You deserve so much better, Em. Always have." Emily wiped her tears, exhaustion settling into her bones. "I don't know what to do, Rachel. I have no job, no home. I can't raise this baby on the streets." Rachel took her hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "You're not alone, Em. You can stay here as long as you need, and we'll figure things out together. I'm a teacher now. It doesn't pay much, but it's enough for both of us until you get on your feet." For the first time in days, Emily felt a weight lift from her chest. She wasn't alone. She had a friend, a safe place to sleep, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to rebuild her life. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, clutching Rachel's hand like a lifeline. Rachel smiled, the same warm smile that had made them instant friends in college. "You don't have to thank me. That's what friends are for. Now let's get you something to eat and then some rest. Tomorrow, we'll start figuring out the next steps." As Emily followed Rachel to the kitchen, she placed a hand on her stomach, a silent promise to her unborn child. James had taken everything from her, her home, her security, her dreams of a family, but he hadn't taken her spirit. With Rachel's help, she would rebuild. She would create a new life, a better life, for herself and her baby. Little did she know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would eventually lead her back to New York, back to James Crawford. But when that day came, she would no longer be the broken woman he had cast aside. She would be stronger than he could ever imagine. Days turned into weeks, and Emily slowly began adjusting to her new reality in Chicago. Rachel's small apartment became her safe haven, a place where she could breathe without fear of being thrown out. Every morning, she would wake up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the sound of city traffic filtering through the windows, and the comforting presence of Rachel, who had become more than just an old friend. She was now family. "You're getting bigger," Rachel observed one morning, smiling as Emily entered the kitchen in a borrowed t-shirt that stretched slightly over her growing belly. Emily placed a hand on the small bump. "For months now. The doctor says everything looks good." Rachel had insisted on accompanying her to prenatal appointments, helping her navigate the complexities of healthcare without insurance. It was one of countless kindnesses that had kept Emily afloat in these difficult weeks. Despite the warmth and kindness Rachel offered, Emily knew she couldn't rely on her forever. She had to stand on her own feet, find a way to support herself, and most importantly, prepare for the arrival of her child. The memory of James and his wealth seemed increasingly distant, like a dream that had turned into a nightmare. "I need to find a job," Emily announced, setting down her coffee mug with determination. "I can't keep living off your generosity." Rachel looked up from grading papers. "You know you're welcome here as long as you need. There's no rush." "There is," Emily insisted. "This baby will be here in 5 months. I need to have something stable by then. A job, maybe my own place." Rachel nodded, understanding the pride that drove her friend. "What kind of work are you thinking about?" Emily sighed. This was a hard part. With James, she'd been a socialite, a corporate wife whose days were filled with charity luncheons and gallery openings. Before that, she'd been a college student with dreams of becoming a writer. Neither experience translated well to the immediate need for income. "Anything," she said honestly. "I just need to start somewhere." Her first challenge was finding employment with no recent work experience and a growing pregnancy that would become impossible to hide. She spent her days walking through the streets of downtown Chicago, filling out applications at cafes, diners, and retail stores. The rejections came swiftly, some polite, others dismissive. "We're looking for someone with experience," they would say, eyes briefly flickering to her midsection. "We're not hiring right now," others would claim, despite the help wanted signs clearly displayed in their windows. After one particularly discouraging interview, where the manager had bluntly asked if she was in a stable situation, Emily sat on a park bench, fighting back tears of frustration. "Don't let them see you cry," she whispered to herself, a mantra she had adopted since leaving New York. "They don't deserve your tears." One afternoon, after hours of job hunting, She stopped at a small diner in River North. The place smelled of grilled burgers and freshly baked pies. The red vinyl booths worn but clean. A sign on the window read, "Help Wanted," and Emily felt a flicker of hope. This was the 8th such sign she'd seen that day, but maybe, just maybe, this one would be different. Desperate but determined, she walked in and approached the counter. A middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a tired expression looked up from wiping a coffee mug. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone businesslike but not unkind. "I saw the sign outside," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Are you still hiring?" The woman, whose name tag read Margaret, studied her for a moment, taking in her appearance. Emily knew what she saw, a young woman with tired eyes and clothes that had seen better days, clearly pregnant and clearly in need. "You ever worked in a restaurant before?" Margaret asked, setting the mug down. Emily shook her head, honesty winning out over desperation. "No, but I'm a fast learner. I can handle customers, I'm good with numbers, and She hesitated, then decided to be completely honest. "I really need this job." Margaret sighed, her expression softening slightly. "It's not easy work. The pay isn't great, the hours can be long, and the customers can be rude. Think you can handle that?" Emily nodded eagerly, hope rising in her chest. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'm stronger than I look." Margaret gave her a skeptical look before reaching under the counter and pulling out an apron. "Fina, you start tomorrow. Morning shift, 6 a.m. Don't be late, and don't expect special treatment, because you're expecting." Emily could have cried with relief. It wasn't much, probably minimum wage and tips, but it was a start, a foothold in her new life. "Thank you. You won't regret it." That night, she shared the news with Rachel, who hugged her tightly. "See? You're already making progress. I told you things would work out." "It's just a waitressing job," Emily said, though she couldn't keep the pride from her voice. "It's a beginning," Rachel corrected her. "Everyone has to start somewhere." The next morning, Emily arrived at the diner 30 minutes early, determined to prove herself. Margaret raised an eyebrow at her punctuality, but nodded approvingly. The diner was a modest place frequented by truck drivers, office workers, and locals who had been coming there for years. The regulars eyed her curiously, a new face in their familiar routine. The work was exhausting, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, clearing tables, all while navigating the growing awkwardness of her changing body. By the end of her first shift, her feet ached, her back throbbed, and she had spilled coffee on herself twice. But she had also earned her first honest tips, small bills that she counted carefully, each one representing independence. "Not bad for a first day," Margaret commented, as Emily hung up her apron. "You coming back tomorrow?" "Try and stop me," Emily replied with a tired smile. As days passed, she started saving every dollar she could. She cut back on expenses, eating only what Rachel cooked at home and walking instead of taking buses. She became a familiar face at the diner, learning the regulars' orders by heart, earning larger tips as she proved her competence. But even with the job, she knew she needed more. Pregnancy came with medical bills, and soon there would be diapers, clothes, and all the expenses of raising a child. The future loomed, both bright with possibility and heavy with responsibility. One evening, after finishing a long shift, she sat across from Rachel at their small kitchen table, a notebook open before her as she calculated her savings. "I need to do more," she admitted, setting down her pen. "This job isn't enough." Rachel, who had been grading papers from her teaching job, looked up thoughtfully. "Have you thought about taking night classes? Maybe something that could help you get a better job after the baby comes." Emily sighed, rubbing her growing belly. "I don't have the time or money for that right now." Rachel tapped her pen against the table, her expression thoughtful. "What about community programs? There are organizations in the city that help single mothers. Some offer scholarships, job training, things that could help you in the long run." The idea sparked hope in Emily. The next day, during her lunch break, she visited the Chicago Women's Resource Center, where she met a counselor named Linda. The center was modest but welcoming, with posters promoting education and empowerment covering the walls. "I'm in a difficult situation," Emily explained, briefly outlining her circumstances without mentioning James by name. I need to build a stable future for my child, but I don't know where to start. Linda listened carefully, her expression compassionate but practical. You're not alone in this, she assured Emily, handing her a list of programs. There are resources available, people who want to help. One of the programs caught Emily's eye, a training course for medical office assistants. It was short, affordable with the center's scholarship, and promised steady job opportunities in a growing field. The classes were in the evenings, after her diner shift, and would be completed before her due date. This one, she said, pointing to the brochure. This could work. Linda smiled. It's a good choice. Healthcare is stable, the pay is decent, and most medical offices understand work-life balance for parents. Emily signed up immediately, determined to build a stable future for her child. The weeks that followed tested her endurance to its limits. She balanced morning shifts at the diner, evening classes at the community college, and doctor's appointments, pushing through exhaustion because she knew every effort was for her child. On Father's Day, a particularly busy morning at the diner, Emily found herself serving a table where a young father sat with his pregnant wife and toddler. The man was attentive, cutting up the child's pancakes, wiping sticky syrup from small fingers, his hand occasionally resting on his wife's belly with obvious pride. The sight sent an unexpected pang through Emily's heart. This was what she had hoped for with James, a partner, a family, shared joy in the miracle of creation. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the grief of that lost dream. You okay, honey? Margaret asked, noticing her stillness. Emily blinked back, unexpected tears. Yes, I'm fine. Margaret followed her gaze to the happy family, understanding dawning in her eyes. The baby's father. He's not in the picture. Emily shook her head. No, he made his choice. Margaret's expression hardened. His loss, then? Some men don't deserve the title of father anyway. She squeezed Emily's shoulder briefly. You're doing just fine on your own. The simple validation meant more than Margaret could know. Emily returned to work with renewed determination, reminding herself that while her child wouldn't have a father, they would have a mother who fought for them with everything she had. Margaret noticed her dedication and began treating her with more respect, occasionally slipping her extra food to take home. For the baby, she'd say gruffly, brushing off Emily's thanks. Can't have you skimping on nutrition. Rachel remained her rock, cheering her on during the toughest days, helping her study for exams, and transforming their small living room into a makeshift nursery corner with secondhand baby items she found at thrift stores. One evening, as Emily sat in her room folding tiny clothes Rachel had bought from a secondhand store, she felt a sudden flutter in her stomach. She froze, placing a hand over the small bump, and then she felt it again, a tiny, unmistakable kick. Oh, she gasped softly, tears filling her eyes. Hello there. The movement was like a promise, a reminder that despite everything, something beautiful was growing from the ashes of her past. You're really in there, aren't you? She whispered, a smile spreading across her face. It was the first moment she truly felt connected to her baby, and it filled her with a love so strong it drowned out all the pain James had caused. In that quiet moment, with her child moving beneath her palm, Emily made a silent vow. This baby would never feel unwanted, would never question their worth, would never know the cold rejection she had experienced. It's just you and me, little one, she murmured, and we're going to be just fine. Meanwhile, across the country, James Crawford continued his life of luxury in New York, completely unaware of the woman he had discarded. His business empire had only grown, his name appearing in Forbes articles and finance magazines, his face gracing charity galas and exclusive social events. Women came and went, none lasting long enough to matter. His mother, who had always disapproved of Emily, introduced him to suitable socialites and daughters of business associates, women who understood the world he inhabited. But something was missing, a hollowness he refused to acknowledge, an emptiness he filled with work and superficial relationships. He had convinced himself that he had done the right thing, that Emily had been nothing more than a mistake, a momentary weakness in his otherwise strategic life plan. He never once wondered about the child he had abandoned, never considered that his actions had consequences beyond his immediate circle. But fate had its way of bringing people back together, and James had no idea that 20 years later, Emily would walk back into his life. Not as the broken woman he had left behind, but as someone far stronger than he could have ever imagined. As Emily's pregnancy progressed and her training continued, she began to see the outlines of a future taking shape. Not the one she had once dreamed of, but one built with her own hands, on her own terms. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. Emily's life in Chicago had transformed in ways she never imagined. Months turned into years, and she had built something stable not just for herself, but for her son, Daniel. From the moment he was born at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, she knew she had a purpose greater than any pain James had inflicted on her. Holding him in her arms for the first time, his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, his blue eyes, so painfully like his father's. Looking up at her with innocent trust, she made a silent promise. "I will never let you feel abandoned the way I did," she whispered against his downy head. "You will always know you are loved." The early years were the hardest. She worked long hours, sometimes double shifts at the diner, while also completing her training as a medical office assistant. Rachel remained by her side, becoming Aunt Rachel to little Daniel, helping care for him when Emily's schedule became overwhelming. Some nights, Emily would come home exhausted, her body aching from hours on her feet, only to find Daniel awake and fussy. On those nights, she would cradle him close, singing softly as they rocked in the second-hand chair Rachel had found at a yard sale. Despite her exhaustion, these quiet moments with her son filled her with a contentment she had never known before. "You're doing an amazing job," Rachel told her one evening, watching as Emily expertly balanced Daniel on her hip while preparing his dinner. "I don't know how you manage it all." Emily smiled tiredly. "One day at a time. That's all any of us can do." By the time Daniel was 5, Emily had secured a full-time job at a pediatric clinic in Lincoln Park, finally leaving the diner behind. Margaret had thrown her a small going-away party, the gruff woman surprising Emily with a cake and a card signed by all the regulars. "You've got grit, girl," Margaret had said, awkwardly patting her shoulder. "Don't forget us when you're running that fancy doctor's office." It was a small victory, but a significant one. The steady paycheck meant she could afford a better apartment, a tiny but cozy 2-bedroom space in a safe neighborhood with good schools. Life was still far from easy, but it was stable. She made sure Daniel had everything he needed: books, warm clothes, and even little treats from time to time. On Daniel's first day of kindergarten, Emily knelt before him, straightening his little backpack and fighting back tears. He looked so small, so precious, and so much like James that it sometimes took her breath away. "Remember what we practiced?" she asked, smoothing his dark hair. Daniel nodded solemnly. "Be kind, listen to the teacher, and make new friends." "That's my smart boy," she said, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I'll be right here when school is over." As she watched him walk into the classroom, his small shoulders squared with determination, Emily felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in the confident little boy she was raising, and sadness that James would never know what he had given up. Emily rarely thought about James in the early days. She had moments of anger, times when she wondered if he ever regretted what he had done. But as years passed, she realized that dwelling on him was a waste of energy. He had chosen to erase them from his life, and she had chosen to build a new one. Daniel grew up into a bright and compassionate boy. He had Emily's dark hair and determined spirit, but his sharp blue eyes were unmistakably his father's, a daily reminder of the man who had walked away. By 3rd grade, he was at the top of his class, his teachers praising his intelligence and kindness. It was around this time that Daniel first asked about his father. They were looking through an old photo album, and he noticed the absence of a man in their family pictures. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "where's my dad? Everyone else has one." Emily had prepared for this moment, knowing it would eventually come. She sat beside him on their small couch, choosing her words carefully. "Your father lives in New York," she said simply. "He's a businessman. We were married, but before you were born, we separated." Daniel's brow furrowed. Didn't he want to meet me? The question pierced Emily's heart. How do you tell a child that his father had rejected him before he was even born? That he had been seen as an inconvenience rather than a blessing? Your father made choices, she said carefully. Sometimes adults make decisions they can't undo. But that doesn't define who you are, Daniel. You are loved and wanted. Never doubt that. Daniel seemed to consider this, his young mind processing information that would be difficult for anyone to understand. Will I ever meet him? Emily stroked his hair. That's something we can talk about when you're older, if you want to. For now, just know that you have me, and Aunt Rachel, and so many people who love you. To her relief, Daniel nodded and turned the page of the album, momentarily satisfied with her answer. But Emily knew this wouldn't be the last time they had this conversation. As Daniel grew older, Emily never hid the truth from him. She told him that his father was a powerful businessman in New York that he had left before Daniel was born. But she never spoke with bitterness, never painted James as a villain in their story. Some people make choices they can't undo, she would say. But that doesn't define who you are. Daniel never asked much about James. To him, his mother was his whole world. He admired her strength, her resilience, and the way she always managed to smile no matter how tired she was. He saw how hard she worked, how she attended every school play and parent-teacher conference, how she helped with homework late into the night despite her early morning shifts. On his 12th birthday, Daniel surprised Emily by saving up his allowance to buy her a small silver necklace with a heart pendant. "Because you have the biggest heart, Mom," he said as he presented it to her. "And you deserve pretty things too." Emily wore that necklace every day after, a reminder of the beautiful soul she was raising. By the time Daniel entered high school, he had become a thoughtful young man with a sharp mind and natural leadership abilities. He excelled in math and science, joined the debate team, and developed a keen interest in finance and economics, subjects that, unknown to him, his father had also mastered. It was during a career day at school that Daniel first began to think seriously about his future. A guest speaker, a financial analyst from a major bank, talked about investment strategies and market analysis. Daniel was captivated, asking questions that impressed even the seasoned professional. "You've got a natural talent for this," the speaker told him afterward. "You should consider business school after college." That evening, Daniel excitedly shared his newfound interest with Emily. "I think I know what I want to do, Mom. I want to work in finance." Emily felt a strange twist in her heart. It seemed genetics had a sense of irony. Daniel was naturally drawn to the same field that had made his father wealthy. But unlike James, Daniel's interests seemed driven by genuine curiosity rather than greed. "That's wonderful," she said, pushing aside her complicated feelings. "You'd be excellent at it." As college application season approached during Daniel's senior year, Emily faced a new challenge. Daniel's grades and test scores were exceptional, earning him acceptance letters from several prestigious universities, including Columbia and New York City, James's territory. "I really want to go to Columbia, Mom," Daniel told her, his eyes bright with excitement. "Their business program is one of the best in the country." Emily's stomach knotted at the thought of her son in the same city as James, possibly even crossing paths with him unknowingly. But she refused to let her fears hold Daniel back. "If that's where you want to go, then that's where you should be," she said, forcing a smile. "You've earned it." By the time Daniel turned 18, he had become everything Emily had dreamed of, a responsible, ambitious young man with a sharp mind and a heart full of kindness. His acceptance into Columbia University filled her with both pride and fear. Letting him go was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she knew he deserved the best opportunities. On the day she dropped him off in New York City, standing on the busy campus surrounded by eager freshmen and teary-eyed parents, Emily hugged him tightly, breathing in the scent of his cologne, memorizing the feel of his tall frame against hers. "Go make your mark on the world, my love," she whispered, fighting back tears. "Just don't forget where you came from." "I could never forget you, Mom," Daniel promised, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I'll call every day." As she watched him disappear into the crowd of students, Emily felt both the weight of her sacrifices and the beauty of what they had built together. She had given him roots and wings, the security of knowing he was loved unconditionally and the freedom to pursue his dreams. Meanwhile, James Crawford's life had gone in a different direction. His success in real estate had reached new heights, making him one of the wealthiest men in New York. His name adorned buildings across the city. His face appeared regularly in business magazines, and his opinions were sought after by financial news networks. But success had come at a cost. Over the years, he had married twice, both times ending in bitter divorces. He had children from both marriages, a daughter and a son, but they barely spoke to him, resenting his absence during their childhoods and his focus on empire building over family. His empire had given him wealth beyond measure, but no real happiness. The hollow feeling that had begun the night he sent Emily away had only grown over the years, though he refused to acknowledge its source. He had always dismissed the past, burying memories of Emily deep within him, believing that what he had done had been necessary for his success. He told himself he had moved on, that she was nothing more than a chapter he had closed long ago. But sometimes, late at night in his penthouse overlooking the city, he would find himself wondering what had become of her, and of the child he had never known. Fate, however, had its own plans. One evening, as Daniel walked through Manhattan, excited about his new life and exploring the city that would be his home for the next 4 years, he found himself in front of a massive skyscraper with the name Crawford Enterprises emblazoned in bold letters across its glass facade. He had heard the name before. His mother had mentioned it when he was younger, a brief reference in the carefully edited story of his past. Curiosity burned within him, and for the first time in his life, he felt an overwhelming urge to know more about the man who had abandoned them. With a racing heart, he pulled out his phone and began searching for information. Article after article painted the image of a ruthless businessman, a man admired for his wealth, but criticized for his lack of empathy. Photos showed a distinguished older man with silver-streaked dark hair and piercing blue eyes, eyes that Daniel saw every morning in the mirror. As Daniel scrolled through images of James Crawford, he felt an unsettling mix of emotions. This was the man who had chosen power over family, who had walked away without looking back. This was his father. That night, Daniel called Emily, his voice careful as he navigated this delicate subject. "Mom," he said slowly, "do you ever wonder if he regrets it?" There was silence on the other end. Emily knew exactly who he was talking about. She took a deep breath before answering. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I stopped wondering a long time ago." Daniel didn't respond right away. His mother had moved on, had built a beautiful life for them without James Crawford. But something inside him needed closure, needed to understand the man whose blood ran in his veins. Over the next few weeks, he researched everything he could about James Crawford. The more he learned, the more conflicted he felt. His father had built a kingdom, but at what cost? Stories of failed marriages, estranged children, and ruthless business dealings painted a picture of a man who had everything but seemed to have nothing at all. One afternoon, while walking near Wall Street, Daniel made a bold decision that would change everything. He entered the towering Crawford Enterprises building, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. The receptionist, a well-dressed woman in her 40s, looked up with a practiced smile. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Daniel admitted, his voice steadier than he felt. "But I need to see Mr. Crawford. It's important." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly used to turning away unscheduled visitors. "And who are you?" Daniel hesitated for only a second before saying the words that had been stuck in his throat for years, words that would open a door to his past and potentially reshape his future. "I'm his son." The receptionist at Crawford Enterprises stared at Daniel for a long moment, her polished demeanor faltering just slightly. There was skepticism in her eyes, but also something else, curiosity, perhaps even recognition. She looked him over carefully, taking in his features, particularly his eyes, which were unmistakably Crawford eyes. "I see," she said finally, her voice measured. "Do you have any identification?" Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions wash over him. He had walked into this building on impulse, driven by a lifetime of questions and the sudden proximity to answers. Now, standing here, claiming his identity, it suddenly felt real in a way it never had before. He was James Crawford's son, The man who had abandoned his mother, the man who had erased him from his life, was sitting somewhere in this massive glass tower, completely unaware that the past was about to knock on his door. He hesitated, then pulled out his driver's license. It wouldn't prove anything. He had his mother's last name, of course, but it might at least establish that he wasn't some random person off the street. The receptionist glanced at the name, but, as expected, it told her nothing. She studied his face again, her professional mask firmly back in place. "Wait here, please," she said, standing up. She disappeared through a sleek glass door, leaving Daniel alone in the grand lobby. He looked around, taking in the towering ceilings, the massive artwork dominating the walls, the carefully curated elegance of it all. This was the world his father had built, the world he had chosen over family. The marble floors gleamed under soft lighting, and employees in expensive suits moved through the space with purpose. Daniel felt simultaneously out of place and strangely at home, as if some part of him recognized this environment at a cellular level. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Daniel shifted on his feet, his heart pounding harder with each passing second. Just as he was beginning to reconsider his decision, wondering if he should simply walk out and pretend this moment of courage had never happened, the glass door opened again. This time, a man in a dark suit emerged. A security officer, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable as he approached Daniel. "Mr. Crawford will see you," he said, his voice firm but neutral. "Follow me." Daniel swallowed hard and nodded. He followed the man through a maze of glass-walled offices and marble hallways, his palms sweating despite the cool air. Employees glanced at him curiously as he passed, perhaps noting his resemblance to the man whose name adorned the building. Finally, they stopped in front of a massive wooden door, incongruously traditional amid the modern design of the rest of the building. The security officer pushed it open, revealing a vast office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's skyline. Behind a sleek black desk sat a man Daniel had only seen in news articles and interviews. James Crawford, his father. James looked up from his laptop, his piercing blue eyes that Daniel saw every day in his own reflection, narrowing slightly as they focused on the young man entering his office. He was older than the photo suggested, with streaks of gray in his dark hair and lines on his face that hinted at years of stress and hard decisions. But he still carried himself with the same aura of power and control that had made him a legend in the business world. For a moment, he simply studied Daniel, his expression unreadable, giving nothing away. Then, in a voice that was both sharp and detached, he said, "Who are you?" Daniel felt his stomach tighten, but he didn't look away. He had come too far to back down now. "My name is Daniel," he said evenly. "Daniel Carter." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before adding, "Your son." James didn't react right away. His fingers, which had been resting on his laptop keyboard, curled slightly. His jaw tensed, but his expression remained carefully composed, the face of a man accustomed to hiding his thoughts during high-stakes negotiations. "I don't have a son named Daniel Carter," he said coolly, though something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. Daniel let out a small, bitter laugh. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that." He took a step closer, refusing to let James dismiss him so easily. "You left my mother when she was pregnant. You threw her out of your house like she was nothing. She raised me alone, worked herself to the bone so I could have a life, and all this time, you've been sitting here in your empire, pretending we don't exist." James exhaled slowly, as if trying to gather his thoughts. He stood up from his chair, moving around the desk with measured steps. Up close, Daniel could see the faint hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of something he couldn't quite define. "Emily Carter," James murmured, almost to himself. That was her name. He looked at Daniel again, and this time there was something more than cold detachment in his gaze. There was recognition, perhaps even a hint of regret, quickly suppressed. "She never tried to contact me," he said, a statement rather than a question. Daniel clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest. "Why would she?" He shot back. "You made it clear she wasn't welcome in your life. You threw her out with nothing." She didn't come crawling back because she had dignity and she didn't need you. James let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time, he looked tired. Not the exhaustion of a businessman after a long day, but something deeper, something heavier. You shouldn't be here, he said finally. Daniel's heart pounded with anger. What? Because it's inconvenient for you. Because it ruins the perfect life you've built for yourself. He shook his head, his voice laced with frustration. I didn't come here looking for money. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted to see you face to face to understand how a man could walk away from his own child and never look back. James was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving to the city skyline visible through the windows. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost contemplative. You think it was easy? He turned away, walking toward the window. You think I haven't thought about it? Daniel stared at him in disbelief. If you thought about it, you sure didn't do anything about it. James let out a bitter chuckle. And what would you have wanted me to do? He turned back to face Daniel, his eyes hard. I was young, ambitious. I wasn't ready to be a father. He paused, studying Daniel's face. And if I had reached out, if I had tried to be part of your life, would Emily have let me? Daniel hesitated. He knew his mother had never spoken about wanting James back in their lives. She had moved forward, built something beautiful without him. But that didn't excuse what James had done. You didn't even try, Daniel said quietly. That's the difference. James studied him, and for the first time, there was something almost resembling regret in his expression. You're right, he admitted, the words seemingly difficult for him to say. I didn't. Daniel took a deep breath. He had come here for answers, and maybe he had gotten them, just not the ones he wanted. His father wasn't a monster. He was just a man, a flawed, selfish man who had made a decision years ago and never looked back. And maybe that was worse. I don't know what I expected, Daniel said, shaking his head. I guess I just needed to see it for myself. He turned toward the door, ready to leave, to close this chapter and move on with his life. But before he could step out, James spoke again. Daniel. Daniel paused, his hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn around, just waited. James hesitated for a fraction of a second before asking, What does your mother think about you being here? Daniel's grip on the doorknob tightened. He turned his head slightly, just enough to meet James's gaze. She doesn't know, he admitted, but I think she stopped thinking about you a long time ago. And with that, he walked out of the office, leaving James Crawford standing alone in his empire, staring at the son he never knew he had. Daniel stepped out of the towering Crawford Enterprises building and into the cool autumn air of Manhattan, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The conversation with James had left him feeling empty, like he had been searching for something that didn't even exist. He had imagined this moment for years, fantasized about confronting the man who had abandoned him and his mother, but the reality had been far less dramatic. His father wasn't some heartless villain, nor was he a remorseful man seeking redemption. He was just a businessman who had made a decision and lived with it. No apologies, no attempts to explain, just a cold acknowledgement of the past. It was almost worse than being outright rejected, because at least rejection came with some level of passion. This, however, was indifference, and that stung in a way Daniel hadn't been prepared for. He walked aimlessly through the busy streets, the honking of taxis and chatter of pedestrians blending into white noise around him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He knew it was his mother, wondering why he hadn't called her back. She had no idea he was here, no idea he had just met the man who had broken her heart 2 decades ago, and he wasn't sure how to tell her. Would she be angry? Disappointed? Or would she simply shake her head and say, I told you so? Daniel wasn't ready for any of those reactions. He needed time to process everything first. Eventually, he found himself in Central Park, where he sat on a bench overlooking the lake. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and joggers passed by, lost in their own worlds. He thought about his mother, about the sacrifices she had made to give him a decent life. She had worked 2 jobs, often coming home late and exhausted, yet she never once let him feel like he was missing out. Every birthday, every school event, every scraped knee, she had been there. And the man who had given him life? He had been nowhere. Pulling out his phone, Daniel finally checked his messages. As expected, there were several missed calls from his mother, along with a few texts. One in particular caught his attention. "Call me. It's important." His stomach tightened as he hesitated for a moment before dialing her number. She picked up on the first ring. "Daniel," she breathed, relief evident in her voice. "Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you all day." "Sorry, Mom," he said, rubbing his forehead. "I just needed some time to think." There was a pause on the other end, as if she was carefully choosing her next words. "Where are you?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. "In the city," he admitted. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also wasn't sure how much to reveal just yet. His mother was silent for a moment, and then she said, "You went to see him, didn't you?" Daniel exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. Of course she would know. She had always been able to read him, even from hundreds of miles away. "Yeah." A long silence followed. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer, almost resigned. "I thought you might eventually." He frowned, surprised by her reaction. "You're not mad?" She let out a quiet laugh, though it lacked any real amusement. "Mad? No, Daniel. I knew this day would come. I don't know. Maybe I hoped you wouldn't have to go looking for answers that won't satisfy you." Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't know what I expected, but he didn't care, Mom. He didn't even try to pretend he felt guilty. He just accepted it, like leaving us behind was just another business decision." His mother sighed, and he could almost see her shaking her head. "That's who he is, sweetheart. That's who he always was." "Did you ever try to reach out to him?" Daniel asked hesitantly, a question that had been on his mind for years. She was quiet for a long time before answering. "No," she admitted. "I was young, heartbroken, and too proud to beg someone to love their own child. And honestly, I didn't want him in your life if he didn't want to be there. You deserve better than that." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. All these years, he had sometimes wondered if his mother had kept him from his father, if there had been attempts at reconciliation that he didn't know about. But the truth was simpler and harder. James had walked away, and Emily had picked up the pieces and built something beautiful from them. "You never told me much about him," he said. "Only that he left." "I didn't want you to grow up with hate in your heart," she said simply. "He made his choice, and I made mine. My choice was to make sure you never felt unwanted." Daniel swallowed hard, emotion welling up inside him. "You did, Mom. You were enough. You were always enough." There was silence on the line, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "That's all I ever wanted to hear." For the first time that day, Daniel felt a sense of clarity. Maybe he hadn't needed to meet James to find closure. Maybe the answers had been with him all along, in the form of the woman who had given him everything despite having nothing. He stood up, looking around the park one last time before saying, "I'm coming home for the weekend. I need to see you." His mother exhaled in relief. "I'll be here. I'm always here." Hanging up, Daniel took one last deep breath before heading toward the subway. He had spent years searching for something, justice, acknowledgement, maybe even revenge, but in the end, none of that mattered. His mother was right. He hadn't needed James Crawford. He never had. And now, finally, he could start living like he believed it. In the days that followed, Daniel immersed himself in his studies, finding solace in the structured world of finance and economics. There was something comforting about numbers that didn't lie, they didn't abandon you. They simply were what they were. He excelled in his classes, his professors noting his natural aptitude and sharp analytical mind. But beneath his academic success, the meeting with James continued to haunt him. Not because he yearned for his father's approval. That desire had died in James's office. But because he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the story, something neither James nor his mother had fully revealed. During his weekend visit home, Emily had listened as he recounted the meeting, her eyes reflecting both sadness and pride. She hadn't seemed surprised by James's reaction, nor had she expressed anger or bitterness. Instead, she had simply held Daniel's hand and said, "You're so much more than his choices, Daniel. You always have been." Those words stayed with him as he returned to New York, as he built a life separate from both his mother's struggles and his father's wealth. He was determined to forge his own path, to be defined by his own actions rather than the shadow of a man who hadn't wanted him. And as the seasons changed and his first year of college progressed, Daniel began to find his footing in the world. Not as James Crawford's son, not even as Emily Carter's son, but simply as Daniel, a young man with his own dreams, his own strengths, and his own future to build. Daniel sat in the quiet of his small apartment in Brooklyn, staring at the dim glow of the city lights outside his window. His meeting with James Crawford had left a strange void inside him, one he wasn't sure how to fill. He had spent years imagining how it would go. Perhaps an explosive confrontation where his father finally admitted his mistakes, or a dramatic reconciliation where James expressed regret and begged for forgiveness. But reality had been cold and different. No anger, no guilt, just a detached acknowledgement of the past. It was almost as if Daniel's existence had been nothing more than an insignificant footnote in the man's life. The realization stung, but in an odd way, it was also liberating. His entire childhood had been spent wondering what he had done to make his father leave, what flaw in him had made him unworthy of love. But now he saw the truth. James's absence had nothing to do with him. It had always been about his father's own selfishness, and knowing that meant Daniel could finally stop blaming himself. The semester was ending, and Daniel had thrown himself into his studies with renewed focus. His professors had noticed his exceptional work, particularly in investment analysis and market theory. One had even recommended him for a prestigious summer internship at a financial firm downtown. Life was moving forward, and for the most part, Daniel was content to let the past remain where it belonged. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he landed on his mother's number. He had already spoken to her after the meeting, but something inside him needed to hear her voice again. He hesitated for a moment before calling, and she answered almost immediately. "Daniel," she said warmly, the familiar comfort in her tone washing over him like a balm. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I just wanted to check in." She chuckled lightly. "Sweetheart, you don't have to check in on me. I'm the mother, remember? I check in on you." A small smile tugged at his lips. "Yeah, well, I just wanted to hear your voice." She paused, as if sensing the weight behind his words. "Are you okay?" Daniel leaned back against the couch, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I thought meeting him would bring me some kind of closure, but it just feels empty." His mother sighed, a sound filled with understanding. "That's because closure doesn't come from other people, Daniel. It comes from within. James wasn't going to give you anything you didn't already have." Daniel closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. As always, she cut straight to the heart of the matter. "You were right about him. About everything." There was a silence on the other end before she said, "I never wanted to be right about this, sweetheart. I would have given anything for him to be the father you deserved." His chest tightened. "You were enough, Mom. You always were." A soft sniffle came through the line, and he knew she was holding back tears. "Thank you, baby. That means more than you know." They talked for a while longer, reminiscing about old memories. How she had taught him to ride a bike in the park near their apartment. How they had celebrated his 10th birthday with a homemade cake that had collapsed in the middle but tasted perfect anyway. How she had worked 2 jobs to pay for his first computer. By the time they hung up, Daniel felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Maybe he hadn't found the closure he was looking for, but he had found something even more valuable, the realization that he had never truly been alone. As the days passed, he focused on work, pouring himself into his projects with renewed energy. He was a financial analyst at a small firm, far from the wealth and power his father wielded, but he was proud of the life he had built. He had worked hard for everything he had, without shortcuts or handouts, and that was something James Crawford could never take away from him. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee at a cafe near Wall Street, he ran into an old college friend, Michael. They hadn't spoken in years, but after catching up over coffee, Michael mentioned a business opportunity, an investment startup that was looking for sharp minds like Daniel's. "We're small now," Michael explained, excitement evident in his voice, "but we're on to something big. Algorithm-based investment strategies for middle-class families, not just the wealthy. Democratizing finance, you know? And we need someone with your analytical skills." At first, Daniel hesitated. He had a stable job, a steady paycheck, a clear career path. But there was something exciting about the idea of building something from the ground up, of proving to himself that he could succeed on his own terms. After a few sleepless nights of weighing his options, he decided to take the leap. He quit his job and joined Michael's startup, throwing himself into long hours and endless meetings. The work was exhausting but fulfilling. He was building something real, something that wasn't tied to his past or his father's name. Months turned into a year, and Daniel found himself thriving. The startup had taken off, securing funding and expanding rapidly. He had built a reputation for himself in the industry, not as James Crawford's son, but as Daniel Carter, a self-made man who had earned his success through sheer determination and intelligence. One evening, as he was preparing for a major investors meeting, he received an unexpected email. It was from a journalist working on a feature about successful entrepreneurs with unique backgrounds. The email mentioned James Crawford, hinting that the journalist knew about Daniel's connection to him. His stomach twisted at the thought of his past being dragged into the spotlight. For a long time, he stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Finally, he took a deep breath and typed a reply. He kept it simple and to the point. I have no connection to James Crawford. My story is my own. And for the first time in his life, he truly believed it. The next morning, Daniel woke to another unexpected message, a text from a number he didn't recognize. We need to talk. It's important. James Crawford. Daniel stared at the message, his heart racing. After their first and only meeting nearly 2 years ago, James had made no attempt to contact him. Why now? What could possibly be so important? For a moment, he considered ignoring it. He had moved on, built a life that had nothing to do with James Crawford. But curiosity won out, and he replied with a simple when and where. The response came almost immediately. My office. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Daniel agreed, though every instinct told him to stay away. He had no idea what James wanted, but he told himself he was strong enough now to face whatever it might be. The following day, he found himself once again in the imposing lobby of Crawford Enterprises. This time, however, he was expected. The receptionist, a different one from his previous visit, greeted him by name and immediately escorted him to the elevator. When he reached James's office, he was surprised to find the door open. James was standing by the window, looking out at the city. He seemed different somehow, thinner perhaps, his posture less commanding than Daniel remembered. You wanted to see me, Daniel said, remaining in the doorway. James turned, and Daniel was struck by the change in his appearance. His face was gaunt, his skin sallow, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. He looked like a man who had been fighting a losing battle. Thank you for coming, James said, his voice lacking the sharp authority Daniel recalled. Please sit down. Daniel entered the office, but remained standing. I prefer to stand. What's this about? James nodded, as if he had expected this response. I've been following your career, he said. Your startup is making waves in the industry. Impressive work. Daniel tensed. If you call me here to discuss business, I'm not interested. No, James said quickly. That's not why I asked you to come. He hesitated, then gestured to a chair. Please, Daniel. This isn't easy for me. Something in his tone made Daniel relent. He sat, watching as James lowered himself into the chair opposite, moving with a careful deliberation that seemed out of character. I don't have much time, James said finally, his gaze direct. I'm dying. The bluntness of the statement caught Daniel off guard. He had prepared himself for many possibilities, business propositions, legal threats, even some belated attempt at reconciliation, but not this. What do you mean? He asked, though the answer was written in James's haggard appearance. Cancer, James replied simply. Stage 4. It's my pancreas liver spreading to my lungs. The doctors say I have months, maybe less. Daniel sat back, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. He had spent years alternately hating and ignoring this man, and now he was being told that James Crawford, the father he had never really known, was dying. I'm sorry, he said finally, because it seemed like the only appropriate response. James shook his head. I didn't tell you this for sympathy. I told you because... He trailed off, seeming to struggle with the words. Because I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, Daniel. A lot of mistakes. And leaving you and your mother, that was the worst one. Daniel remained silent, watching as James reached for a glass of water on the side table, his hand trembling slightly. I know it's too late, James continued after taking a sip. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness or understanding, but I wanted you to know that I regret it. Every day, I regret it. Daniel's chest tightened. He had imagined this confession so many times, had dreamed of his father acknowledging the pain he had caused. But now that it was happening, he didn't feel the satisfaction he had expected. Instead, he felt a strange emptiness, as if the vindication had come too late to matter. Why now, he asked. Why wait until you're dying to say this? James let out a bitter laugh. Because I'm a coward, Daniel. I always have been. It took facing my own mortality to make me see what really matters. He looked down at his hands. I've built an empire, but I have no one to share it with. My other children don't speak to me. My ex-wives hate me. I'm surrounded by people who want something from me, but no one who actually cares. Daniel remained silent, unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to say that James had made his bed and now had a lie in it. But another part of him, a part he hadn't expected, felt a twinge of pity for this man who had everything and nothing. I don't expect you to forgive me, James said, meeting Daniel's gaze again. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that leaving you wasn't because of anything you did. It was my failure, not yours. The words touched something deep inside Daniel, addressing a wound he had carried since childhood. Despite everything, despite knowing intellectually that his father's absence wasn't his fault, he had always harbored a secret fear that there was something inherently unlovable about him. I built a good life without you, Daniel said finally. My mother made sure of that. James nodded, a flicker of something like respect crossing his face. Emily was always stronger than I gave her credit for. How is she? She's well, Daniel said, unwilling to share more. His mother's life was her own, not something to be casually discussed with a man who had hurt her so deeply. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 20 years hanging between them. Finally, James spoke again, his voice softer. I have no right to ask anything of you, Daniel. But if you're willing, I'd like to get to know you in whatever time I have left. Not as a father, I forfeited that right long ago, but perhaps as someone who cares about who you've become. Daniel studied the man before him, searching for signs of manipulation or insincerity. But all he saw was exhaustion, regret, and a vulnerability that the powerful James Crawford would never have shown willingly. I don't know if I can do that, Daniel said honestly. I don't know if I want to. James nodded, accepting this without argument. Understand. The offer stands if you ever change your mind. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a business card, writing a number on the back. This is my personal cell. If you ever want to talk about anything, I'll answer. Daniel took the card hesitantly, slipping it into his pocket. He stood, feeling suddenly that he needed air, needed space to process this unexpected turn of events. I should go, he said. James stood as well, moving with that same careful deliberation. Thank you for coming, Daniel. It means more than you know. As Daniel turned to leave, James spoke once more. You've built something remarkable, you know. Your company, your life. You did it all without me, and that's something to be proud of. Daniel paused at the door, looking back at the man who had given him life but nothing else. Goodbye, James. He walked out of the office, his mind reeling. He had come seeking nothing, expecting nothing, and yet he left with something he couldn't quite name. Not closure, not forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. As he stepped out onto the busy street, the weight of James's revelation settled on his shoulders. His father was dying. The man he had spent years trying to forget, trying to outrun, would soon be gone forever. And Daniel had no idea how he felt about that. Daniel sat in the quiet of his New York apartment, staring at the city skyline through the large glass windows. The meeting with his father had left him in turmoil, a mix of anger, confusion, and something he wasn't ready to name yet. He had always believed that if he ever saw James Crawford again, he would feel nothing but hatred. He had imagined the confrontation so many times, him standing tall, successful, throwing his achievements in his father's face, making him regret every moment he had chosen to abandon them. But reality had been far more complicated. His father was a dying man, stripped of his arrogance, facing the end of his life with the weight of his regrets pressing down on him. And that changed everything. The business card James had given him sat on his coffee table, the handwritten phone number facing up like a challenge. For 3 days, Daniel had avoided it, throwing himself into work, attending meetings, handling investments. Anything to keep his mind from wandering back to that office, to the gaunt face of the man who had shaped his life through absence. On the 4th day, he called his mother. "I saw him again," he said without preamble when she answered. "He's dying, Mom. Cancer." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Emily finally spoke, her voice was soft, measured. "How do you feel about that?" It was such a simple question, yet Daniel found he had no simple answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought I'd feel satisfied, maybe, like some kind of justice was being served. But I just feel hollow." "That's because you're not the kind of person who finds joy in another's suffering," his mother said gently. "Even when they've hurt you. That's what makes you different from him." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his own conflicted emotions. "You want to get to know me before it's too late." Another pause, longer this time. "And what do you want, Daniel?" That was the question, wasn't it? What did he want? Closure? Answers? Some kind of relationship with a man who would soon be gone? "I don't know," he repeated. "Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell. But another part is curious," his mother finished for him. "It's natural to want to know where you come from, who you are. Would it bother you?" Daniel asked, the question that had been weighing on him. "If I spent time with him?" Emily's response was immediate and firm. "No, you're a grown man, Daniel. This is your decision, not mine. I made my peace with James Crawford a long time ago." "How?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious. "How did you move past it?" He heard his mother sigh, a sound filled with years of hard-won wisdom. "I realized that holding on to anger was only hurting me, not him. And I had you to think about. I couldn't raise you with bitterness in my heart." After they hung up, Daniel sat for a long time, staring at the business card. Finally, he picked up his phone and dialed the number. James answered on the second ring, his voice stronger than Daniel had expected. "Daniel," he said, a note of surprise evident. "I didn't think you'd call." "Neither did I," Daniel admitted. "But I've been thinking about what you said, about regrets." "I have many," James replied simply. "I'm not promising anything," Daniel warned. "But I'm willing to talk. Just talk." He could hear the relief in James's voice. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you." They arranged to meet the following day at a small cafe in Central Park, neutral territory away from the imposing shadow of Crawford Enterprises. When Daniel arrived, James was already there, seated at a corner table, looking strangely out of place in casual clothes rather than his usual business suit. "I wasn't sure you'd come," James said as Daniel sat across from him. "I wasn't either," Daniel replied honestly. An awkward silence fell between them. 2 decades of absence impossible to bridge with small talk. Finally, James spoke. "I don't know where to begin," he admitted. "There's so much I don't know about you." Daniel studied him, noting the tremor in his hands as he reached for his coffee cup. "Why don't you ask me something? That's usually how conversations work." A faint smile crossed James's face. "Fair enough. What made you choose finance? Was it because of me?" Daniel considered the question. "Not consciously," he said slowly. "I've always been good with numbers, with seeing patterns. It came naturally." "Nature over nurture," James murmured. "Some things are in the blood, I suppose." "Maybe," Daniel conceded, "but I use it differently than you do. My company helps ordinary people invest, not just the wealthy. We're trying to level the playing field." Interest flickered in James's eyes. "Tell me about that." To Daniel's surprise, he found himself explaining his business model, the algorithm they developed, their vision for democratizing investment opportunities. James listened attentively, asking insightful questions that revealed his sharp business mind. "You've created something remarkable," he said when Daniel finished. "Something with purpose. Unlike Crawford Enterprises?" Daniel couldn't help asking, a hint of challenge in his voice. James didn't take the bait. "I built my company to make money," he acknowledged. "You're building yours to make a difference. That's admirable. The conversation shifted, moving cautiously from business to more personal territory. James asked about Daniel's childhood, listening with evident regret as Daniel described growing up without a father, the questions from classmates, the father-son events he'd attended alone or with his mother's friends. "She never spoke badly of you," Daniel said, surprising himself with the admission. "She could have poisoned me against you, but she didn't." James looked down at his hands. "She's a better person than I am. Always was." As they parted ways that day, Daniel felt strangely unsettled. He had expected to hate every moment with James, to feel vindicated by his suffering. Instead, he found himself seeing glimpses of a complex man, still flawed, still selfish in many ways, but also capable of genuine regret. Over the following weeks, they met regularly. Sometimes their conversations flowed easily, particularly when discussing business or current events. Other times, they stumbled into painful territory. James's abandonment, his failed relationships with his other children, the emptiness of his achievements. During one meeting, as they walked slowly through Central Park, James's health visibly declining with each passing week, he asked the question Daniel had been dreading. "Would you tell me about your mother? How she is now?" Daniel hesitated. His mother's life felt sacred, something to be protected from James's belated interest. But he found himself answering anyway. "She's good. She went back to school when I was in high school, got her degree in social work. She helps women in crisis now, single mothers, victims of domestic violence. She's happy, I think." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She found meaning. That's more than I can say." "It's not too late," Daniel said, surprising himself. "You still have your foundation. You could redirect it, focus on causes that matter." James glanced at him, a spark of interest in his tired eyes. "What would you suggest?" That conversation marked a turning point. In the weeks that followed, James began restructuring his charitable foundation, with Daniel's input, to focus on supporting single parents and educational opportunities for underprivileged children. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could erase the past, but it was something. As James's condition worsened, their meetings moved from the cafe to his penthouse, where he increasingly spent his days resting. Daniel was struck by the contrast between the luxurious surroundings and the frail man who inhabited them. All that wealth, powerless against the disease consuming him. During one visit, he found James reviewing legal documents, his face drawn with fatigue. "Estate planning," James explained, setting the papers aside. "Not the most cheerful task, but necessary." Daniel nodded awkwardly, unsure what to say. They had never discussed inheritance or money. It seemed tacky, given the circumstances. "I won't insult you by offering you money," James said, reading his discomfort. "You've made it clear you want nothing from me. But there are some personal items, things I'd like you to have if you're willing." "What kind of things?" Daniel asked cautiously. James gestured to a bookshelf across the room. "There's a journal there. Several, actually. I've kept them for years. They might help you understand. Not to excuse, but to understand." Daniel was silent, processing this unexpected offer. The idea of reading his father's private thoughts was both intriguing and uncomfortable. "You don't have to decide now," James said. "Just think about it." 2 weeks later, Daniel received a call from James's assistant. His condition had deteriorated rapidly. He had been admitted to the hospital and was asking for Daniel. When Daniel arrived at the private hospital room, he was shocked by the change in James. The powerful businessman was gone, replaced by a skeletal figure in a hospital bed, attached to monitors and 4 lines. But his eyes, those Crawford blue eyes, were still sharp, still present. "You came?" James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I came," Daniel replied, taking the seat beside the bed. They sat in silence for a while, the beeping of machines the only sound. Finally, James spoke again. "I never got to be your father," he said, his eyes fixed on Daniel. "But in these last few weeks, you gave me a chance to be something close. I'm grateful for that." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. He had never called James Dad, and he probably never would. But in that moment, he reached out and squeezed his father's hand. It was the closest thing to forgiveness he could offer. "I'm glad we had this time," he said simply. James Crawford passed away 2 days later, slipping away in his sleep with Daniel and a nurse, the only ones present. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by business associates, politicians, and socialites. People who had known James Crawford, the businessman, not the man. Daniel stood at the back. Watching his eulogies painted a picture of a visionary, a titan of industry, a philanthropist. None of them mentioned his failures as a father, his regrets, or the quiet reconciliation of his final days. That belonged to Daniel alone. After the service, James's lawyer approached him with a sealed envelope. Mr. Crawford left specific instructions that this be given to you personally, he explained. Inside was a letter and a key to his safe deposit box. The letter was brief. Daniel, the journals are in the box, along with letters I wrote to you and your mother over the years but never sent. I was too much of a coward to mail them, but perhaps they'll help you understand the man I was, for better or worse. My greatest regret was not knowing you. My greatest blessing was that you gave me a second chance at the end. James. The safe deposit box contained not only journals and unsent letters, but also old photographs. Emily young and smiling, looking at the camera with love in her eyes. A sonogram image that must have been Daniel. Newspaper clippings about Daniel's academic achievements and business success that James had collected over the years. James Crawford's will left everything to Daniel. Not just his wealth, but his personal journals, letters he had written but never sent, pieces of a man he had never truly known. At first, Daniel didn't know what to do with it all. But as time passed, he found himself reading through the pages, understanding his father in ways he never had before. The journals revealed a complex man, driven, often ruthless in business, but also plagued by doubts and regrets he never showed the world. There were entries about Emily, about the child he had abandoned, questions about what might have been if he had made different choices. One entry, dated just weeks after he had thrown Emily out, caught Daniel's attention. I saw a young father with his child today. They were in the park, the man holding his son's hands as he took his first steps. Something twisted inside me. What have I done? But it's too late now. She'll never forgive me, and why should she? Another, years later. My son would be starting school this year. Does he look like me? Does he hate me? Does he even know I exist? I could find out. I have the resources. But what right do I have to disrupt their lives now? The most recent entries were about Daniel himself, reflections on their meetings, observations about the man his son had become. He has Emily's compassion and my head for business. But unlike me, he uses it for something meaningful. I see now what I missed, not just watching him grow up, but the chance to become a better man through knowing him. Months later, as Daniel stood in his office looking out at the city he had built his life in, he realized something. He had spent years chasing success to prove a point, to prove that he didn't need his father. But now, for the first time, he was no longer running. He was moving forward, not in defiance of his past, but in acceptance of it. He picked up the phone and dialed his mother's number. "Mom," he said when she answered, "I've been thinking. The foundation James restructured before he died. It's doing good work, but it could do more. I'm considering taking a more active role." "Are you sure that's what you want?" she asked. No judgment in her voice, only concern for him. Daniel thought about the journals, about the complex, flawed man who had been his father, about the legacy that could be reshaped into something meaningful. "Yes," he said firmly, "I think it is. Not for him, but for what it could become." "Then I'm proud of you," she said simply. "You've always had the ability to see beyond hurt to what matters." As he hung up, Daniel looked at the framed photo on his desk, himself and his mother at his college graduation, her face beaming with pride. Beside it now sat another frame, containing the sonogram image he had found among James's possessions. Past and present, the complicated threads of family and legacy. He had never needed James Crawford's money or power. But perhaps, in an unexpected way, his father had given him something valuable after all. The understanding that a person's worth wasn't measured by their mistakes, but by their capacity to acknowledge them and attempt, however imperfectly, to make amends. Daniel would never forget the pain of abandonment, would never fully forgive the years of absence. But he had found something more important than forgiveness or vindication. He had found peace, the ability to look at his past without bitterness and his future without fear. And that, perhaps, was the greatest inheritance of all.